Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Two Button Crew podcast. I'm your host, Glenn, and I am joined once again by Nathan Blake of Nathan Blake Games.
Hello, everyone.
And today we're talking about something a little bit different. We are going to be talking about the DS cult classic game, 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors. I hope I got that right. Did I get those in the right order?
I think so. I usually just call it 999 because it's way easier.
Yeah, so before I continue, I want to just preface this by saying that this game is rated M for mature. That is audiences 17 and up. For those of you who maybe don't live in North America and aren't familiar with the ESRB, we are, of course, a family-friendly podcast, but we may be talking about some slightly more mature subject matter than we normally do in this discussion. So just be forewarned about that. We'll try to avoid going into any particularly lurid details, but anyway. So without further ado, let's go into as we normally do with these discussions. Let's talk about our history with this game. So, Nathaniel, you were the one who recommended this game to me. How did you get into this?
Yeah, so I had a close friend a while back who was really into this particular gaming podcast, which wasn't Two Button Crew. But anyway, one of the guys on that podcast talked about this series quite a bit right as the final installment of the series came out. And as he was talking about it, it was just really clear that the storyline on this thing was just like wackadoodles crazy and really interesting. And then whenever he mentioned that it was like, just a little bit darker, or maybe a lot of bit darker, and was on a Nintendo handheld, I was like intrigued, to say the least. So I started playing it, and then found out that the same friend that introduced me to that podcast also was a fan of the Nonary Games series, or the Zero Escape series. So yeah, I started playing them. I went through the first one very quickly, just like played through it in just a couple of days, because it's fairly addictive, honestly, because the story is so interesting and so many mysteries and stuff like that. When I tried to get into the second one initially, I did not, in fact, get into it at all. And I put it aside for about a year before I came back, played it, really enjoyed it, and then waited until the third one came out on the PC and got that one on Steam for when it was on sale and played through it. So that's pretty much my history with it, going back, I guess, about 6 years now. And I've just been kind of, ever since then, just been completely enamored with how weird of a thing it is that this was a Nintendo, handheld game series originally, and how few people actually knew anything about it. So, yep, that's my history with it.
Yeah, so this was a game that was always on my... I was always aware of it, because it got it got a fair amount, and it's... sequels also got a fair amount of coverage from Nintendo Power. I guess the sequels were more Nintendo Power's spiritual successor, NF Magazine. But yeah, it got a fair amount of coverage in Nintendo Power. But it's just one of those things where I read about it and I go, oh, okay, that sounds like something that is completely outside my wheelhouse. And so it was always just one of those things that I was kind of aware of on the periphery. I didn't really consider playing it until, heck, I remember years ago on your channel, you recommended the game in one of your videos. You're like, guys, I just discovered this game series. It's really good. I'm like, yeah, whatever. I know about that. I didn't. The only reason I played it is because I asked you, hey, what's a game that you would like to cover on the podcast? Because for those of you who don't know, I typically am the one who picks the topics for the podcast. As a, I don't know, like benevolent dictator. But it's like, oh, okay, I guess I need to check this out. And so I remember I mentioned, okay, here's my timeline for what I want to do for the year. I mentioned, I promised Nathaniel that I do 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors. And I said I would do it after the Splatoon podcast. And the thing is, I have this policy of never buying a game on Steam unless it's on sale. Just kind of as a matter of principle, is because I realized after a point I've never bought in a game that wasn't on sale on Steam up to this point, and I'm not about to change that now. Once
can't break the streak.
Yeah, can't ruin the hot streak there. I was like, well, I don't know. I don't want to buy it if it's not on sale, and then I find out that it's like $6 on Steam.
Which the hilarious part about that is that whenever I really got playing it was whenever they released it more recently on like PlayStation 4 and stuff, just a few years back. And so when you told me that it was on sale for $6 on Steam, I just went ahead and grabbed it. So I have it on my Steam library as well.
Let's talk about that briefly. Do not pick up the DS version of this game. It is crazy expensive. Just get it on Steam. There's also some quality of life changes on Steam. The Steam version, where like the original version of the game, you didn't have like in the version I played. There's a timeline where you can like jump around in the story. The original version, you couldn't do that. If you wanted to get a multiple ending, you had to play through the entire story again.
Correct. Yeah, that was a large complaint. The original one was that a lot of people didn't like it, that, there were multiple timelines, multiple endings, and some of them you even had to finish one of the other endings before you would be allowed to play that ending. And so you were just replaying the game just over and over and over again. And it's not a short game for, like, this sort of thing.
No. But, so, we've talked a lot about our how we got into it. But what even is this game? And I put game in quotation marks because most people consider this a visual novel. And visual novels I think they're a little bit, like there's a little bit more of an understanding of what they are nowadays than when this game first came out, or visual novel, or whatever you want to call it. A piece of entertainment software. Wow, that sounds like a euphemism for something much worse. Anyway. So what exactly is a visual novel? Nathaniel, I think maybe you have more experience with this because you've played Steins Gate and this and so forth, so maybe you could elucidate us.
Yeah, so visual novels tend to be in the same style as manga or anime. They, almost always do originate, or at least originally originated in Japan. They have that same general feel. The stories are usually the same types of tropes as anime and manga, so you'll see a lot of the same general story ideas. Quote-unquote gameplay-wise, again, as we're kind of talking about this, you're really just watching, 2D representations of the characters talking to each other. In some of them, you don't even get to make any choices. So it really is just a visual novel. It's just exactly what it says on the tin for those ones. The more popular ones do tend to have key choices that you can make along the way for the main character. And, sometimes you get to name the main character or whatever. And those ones do end up having multiple endings, generally speaking, which is what really a lot of people are looking for whenever they're playing a lot of these, is the ability to kind of change the story. Because, like you say, it's kind of hard to say for sure if you can classify a visual novel as a game, although I still think you do for the most part. But if this has gameplay, it's deciding what the ending of the story is going to be like. Now, of course, visual novels spin off into everything from the Phoenix Wright series, which has, like puzzle and mechanics and stuff like that mixed in around it, to dating sims, obviously, which is, just ones where the choices cause the endings to be about the girl that you want to be your waifu as opposed to something else, So that's essentially what I would classify visual novels as. The really, really popular ones would be the Phoenix Wright ones, the Steins Gate, as you mentioned before. I'm trying to think. There was one more that I actually even have started, but I can't remember the name of right now. And it's like crazy and starts out like a dating sim, and then apparently there's like multiple entries with like time travel and alternate universes and giant robots and stuff. Anyway, maybe I'll remember that later. Anyway, there we go. Yeah, there we go. Visual novels.
Yeah, so honestly, visual novel is one of those things where, like the Ace Attorney series, I know a lot of people consider them visual novels, and I can see where people are coming from, but to me, that's a point-and-click adventure game. It's a very chatty point-and-click adventure game, but it's a point-and-click adventure game. And then, this game, like you describe it as the main gameplay is making decisions at key points in the story, but there is, and we'll get into that a little bit more later, but there is gameplay here with puzzles that you have to solve and like. So,
correct, yeah.
I don't know, where does like an adventure game and a visual novel, where's the barrier between the two?
I think that barrier is becoming harder to tell simply because of the swing in art styles, as we kind of get this, singularity of cultures over the internet. I think before it would have been really easy to tell because I think the anime art style does lend itself incredibly to the definition of visual novel, right? So the fact that the characters are interacting with each other with the 2D anime styled art characters and having conversations, and that's what pushes the story forward, I think really is kind of the key thing there, and probably how much of the game is story versus how much of the game is some sort of gameplay. And you'll see with a lot of the ones like Phoenix Wright, the Danganronpa series, and the 999 series, that...
And Danganronpa is not the one with the robots and the multiple timelines you were struggling to think of the name of.
Correct, it's not.
Okay. Sorry, please
It's
continue.
actually... Oh, you're fine. Danganronpa is incredibly similar to Phoenix Wright, actually, except for a lot more murder-happy. But just to say that I think that art style is one of the hugest things, and then the fact that the majority of the time you spend with it is actually on story beats and characters interacting, as opposed to like any kind of like gameplay, is probably one of the big deciding factors. But the issue comes into the fact that like as the singularity of the internet like combined culture happens, we start having this thing where like, just random people are just going to be learning how to do anime and manga styled art and just using it for their game, right? And so you're an indie developer and you slap some waifus in your game, and that's how you tell your story around your like Metroidvania. Does that make it a visual novel Metroidvania now?
Are you making an oblique reference to the Shantae series?
I didn't mean to, but yes.
Well, we'll get into the gameplay, what gameplay is here in a second. Let's talk a little bit about the story, because that is the main draw of this, and we'll be going over the spoiler-free version of the story first, and then we'll talk about the spoilers a little bit later on. So, the game is about Junpei, a young man who awakens on a ship with 8 other people, each of whom have a little wristband that has a number displayed on it. It's like a little electronic, it's kind of like a digital watch. Number displayed on it. And they are informed by, over an intercom or something, by a figure who calls themselves, it's not really clear whether they're a man or a woman, calls themselves Zero, that they have 9 hours to escape the ship, and to do so, they're going to have to go through a series of doors that have numbers painted on them. And to get through the doors, only people whose wristbands add up to or have a digital root matching the number on the door can go through the door. And then there's like only 3 people, a minimum of 3 people and a maximum of 5 people can go through the door. And so they have to navigate the ship and try to find a way out while going through these doors. And if they try to cheat, well, they have bombs in their intestinal tracts that will explode if they try to go through a door that they're not supposed to. Did I get everything?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, and then once they make it through these doors, oftentimes there is some sort of puzzle that they must complete in order to move forward. I think that's the only last point. Basically, I would say like the most concise way, but of course this just relies on mimetic culture, but is that it's Saw, but a visual novel.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's very, it reminds me a lot of Saw, despite the fact that I've never actually watched any of the Saw movies. Thankfully, there are no actual death traps in this one. Most of the escape rooms are actually fairly tame.
Yeah, I think the closest thing would be rooms that, like, something is happening, like, where if you don't get out in a certain amount of time, you could see how you would eventually die in that room. Like, even the first room you start in, theoretically, there's water pouring into it. But, like, they're not even, like, super overt of, like, you're going to die in 20 minutes, you know, like...
But anyway, that's the basic setup. And as you might imagine, it's with a plot like that, it's very character-centric because you have a limited number of characters, and there's a lot of drama with different personalities clashing against each other and so forth. So what do you think of the character dynamics and the characters?
I thought that they were super interesting. You know, you get a lot of very interesting personality types, especially early on. You have no idea, and again, like staying is trying not to spoil anything. Early on, you don't have any idea whether or not any of these characters may or may not have any history with each other, and so like seeing them sort of bounce off of each other is truly interesting. And you have a lot of different interesting archetypes, you know, that are there. And each character does seem to have a very well fleshed out sort of backstory and personality type, and they're mostly all believable for the most part. Only a couple of characters here or there are you like, oh yeah, okay, sure.
Yeah, and it is one of those things where you say archetype, and it's one of those things where you kind of try to sort of categorize them at first. And it's like, oh, okay, that's the big dumb one. But, you know, the further you go on, you know, like the quote-unquote big dumb guy, who they all give themselves code names because they don't want to use their real names just in case Zero is listening in on them. They give themselves code names. So the big guy calls himself, his number is 7, and so he calls himself 7, which
It's
you know, you're like, okay,
so inspired.
Yeah, so inspired. But the thing is, the further on you go in the game, he starts saying things that are like actually pretty insightful observations, and you realize, okay, he's not really stupid. He's maybe a bit brash, but and you know, a lot of the characters they have extra layers to them. You know, you don't just there's more to them than meets the eye.
Right, and it does really, like you say, with this sort of game, it's just the 9 characters is pretty much all you have to interact with. But then, like, we've already talked about how there are, like, theoretically branching storylines and things like that. And so you get sort of a better feel for each character than you could reasonably get in a different story, because you get to see how these characters interact in new situations that you know, wouldn't have seen just in one storyline, right? Because you see one character act one way, and then you see, oh, but whenever you go down this story branch and they're pushed to their limit, you see how they act then. And it's kind of interesting, you know, because you get a better idea for each individual character than you would in a lot of other games, because each character kind of gets their moment to, like, show you who they really are, because a lot of them have endings that are, you know, more or less associated with them.
Yeah, and one of the things I really like about this is that there's part of the story is there's kind of this undercurrent, like this understanding that people might start turning on each other out of desperation. Mm-hmm. Like that's kind of constantly in the back of your mind. But the thing is, the characters. One of the things I really like is that that's not they don't actually resort to that to like an unbelievable extent. You have a few characters who are like, "Hey, look, I've been running the numbers. I don't think we're all going to make it out of here." And so that is introduced at kind of early on, but most of the people are like, "Okay, you know what? Let's wait until we're actually in that situation before we start turning on each other." And that's one of the things I liked is that the characters seemed far more inclined toward cooperating with one another than what you would usually expect to see in this kind of scenario. In terms of fiction, I'm not necessarily meaning how people would react in real life.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and that's one of the things I played through all three of these ones and a couple of the Danganronpa games, and they're made they have the same like parent producer, but they're made by different creators and stuff. And eventually those creators did work together on one game. But anyway, those ones, in almost an attempt to like have a kind of gotcha moment at the end of each chapter, it really is super unclear who could possibly be the killer of any individual like murder or something, and someone always dies in each chapter of the Danganronpa games, and then it could literally have been anyone that did it. And there's something interesting about that, like figuring out, oh, why did this character do it, blah blah blah. But like, it doesn't always feel very character consistent for you to be like, yeah, no, literally anybody in this room could be an actual murderer. Whereas, yeah, in 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors, you get this general vibe of like, I feel like maybe some of these people are pretty sketchy, but like no one seems to be like out for blood trying to kill people just because. Mm-hmm. And so, which in Danganronpa I should give it credit, there is technically a story reason why anyone would be willing to kill anybody else. But anyway, that just said that I appreciated that this one really allows those characters to not just... You don't just see any of these characters just killing anybody at any given moment, and they all stay character consistent. And very rarely do I feel like there's a moment where it's like, haha, you never would have expected this person to be the bad guy, but they are, And when it does, they pay off well.
Yeah, if there is like a weird moment for a character, you just play a different timeline and you go, okay, that explains it.
Exactly. And again, that's kind of how this story allows for you to get to know these characters better than you would in a lot of other stories and a lot of other games, which I think really lends itself to it well. And the high stakes, like, idea of it being essentially murder games and death traps and stuff, like, really lends itself to that too, because it's kind of inevitably the question that you find yourself asking, what will people do if there's a zombie apocalypse or whatever, it's a curious thing that we think about a surprising amount as humans of like, if we push people to the brink, how would they act? And this is one of those games that actually does a pretty good job of asking some of those questions in a way that makes quite a bit of sense until you get into some of the more story beats that are kind of absolutely insane, but we'll get to that.
Yeah. One of the things that you mentioned is that you think visual novels tend to be very, tend to incorporate a lot of the tropes of anime and manga. And I would actually say one of the things I really liked about this game is, despite the fact that the art style does very clearly have kind of an anime aesthetic to it, the writing actually feels more like a book. It doesn't really feel like anime or manga or a light novel or anything like that. It has a much more mature, down-to-earth, kind of grounded feel to it.
Yeah, it certainly does, and that's actually one of the things that attracted me to it anyway. I've tried to get into visual novels over the years, and I'm a big fan of anime in general, but like normally they don't actually like suck me in and get me that interested. But this one that was really one that like the story was like interesting enough, and like trying to, like, whether they succeed or not, they were trying to have kind of deeper meanings to things and be kind of philosophical and like pseudoscientific and things like that. And it was very intriguing and kind of like vaguely grounded in a lot of things. And of course, they get into some of the like supernatural, possibly anime kind of nonsense here or there. But you're never even sure if those things are real as you go through the story until you get to the end and find out what's really going on.
Yeah, and well, what I'm talking about is that anime tends to have this sort of bombastic quality to it. And I think that's part of what people like about anime, is that it tends to be a little bit over the top, even when it's trying to be grounded. And I did not really detect that here so much. And like the example I would give is there's the character number 8, Lotus. She tends to she wears a very showy outfit, let's say. Not a particularly modest person, and in like something that was anime, you would get a lot of people making kind of leering comments about her. And here they don't do that too much. When people comment on the way she dresses, it's usually with like just a mild annoyance. It's like, do you really have to dress like that? Which to me feels more realistic than the sort of, oh my gosh, isn't she so hot? I want to stare at her slack jawed for the next 5 seconds.
Yeah, each individual character tends to be more like a real person. You still get a little bit of those sort of tropes in there where like they kind of fit some of those roles. And even like you were saying, like, you know, you see Seven and you're like, oh, he's the big dumb one, you know. But like they all quickly start subverting those general ideas, and they're a lot more grounded than a lot of those tropes tend to be. Yeah, like Junpei, the main character, is very heroic a lot of times. He is kind of self-sacrificing, seems like a pretty nice dude. But because you have control over his choices, you can do some kind of like jerk moves here or there, honestly. But also like his heroicism is not usually, you know, that he learned kung fu whenever he was a kid and now he's the best fighter around or anything. It was just like, yeah, no, he doesn't mind getting the crap kicked out of him for the girl that he likes, you know?
Yeah. And we'll get more into the characters individually, but that's something I really appreciate about this, is that you look at the anime art style and you think that it's going to have kind of that anime sort of hyper, I don't know what you would
bombasticness.
Yeah, bombasticness. I was hoping to not rely too heavily on one word, but I think another term is hyper reality. When things are kind of accentuated beyond what is reasonable. I've heard people use that to describe pro wrestling.
Yeah.
But
and pro wrestling is absolutely just anime for adult men in America.
Yeah, it's redneck anime.
Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah, that was something I really appreciated about the way it was written. But let's move on to the gameplay before we go on to the end, talk about the presentation after that, and then we'll get to the spoiler section. So, as we said before, this is a visual novel, and what that means is you are going to be reading a lot of text. Well, or you would be, except for the fact that this version of the game has voice acting, so you're probably going to be listening to a lot of voice acting if you're so inclined.
Which does actually slow you down a little bit if you're a fast reader, which is kind of unfortunate, but the voice acting is really good. Like, I never had any complaints.
Yeah, but yeah, so there's a lot of text here, and at a few junctures, you get to make a decision. And there aren't many decisions in this game. There aren't that many branches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they this one only has, like, I don't know, like 9 endings or something. I think there are officially 6 endings, but there's, like, multiple endings that end up the same way, and so I think they do come to about 9 endings. I can't remember for sure.
No, I think officially there are 6 endings, and one of those endings is like it is like an extension of another ending, because it's a visual novel, so you're going to have the good ending.
Right, exactly.
And then one of those is like, if you haven't fulfilled the requirements to unlock the good ending, you just get to that, and then it's like, well, you would have gotten the good ending, but you didn't do your homework, so here's the
yeah, you didn't study for the test.
Yeah, here's another bad ending.
Yeah. And so the sequel to this one, Virtue's Last Reward, has, I believe, 27 endings. And the final one has even more, I think. So you really get into, like, I don't actually like many of the endings of Virtue's Last Reward comparatively to the endings of this one, because even the bad endings in this one have some interesting stuff to do and say. And so I do actually think, in this case, even though there's not a whole lot of choices because that kind of, it kind of limits the quote unquote gameplay. I do think that it did a good job with the number that it had, whereas the next one I think doesn't do quite as good a job with individual stories, although there are a couple that are still really good.
Yeah.
So if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, okay, so this only has like a handful of ways the story can go, still I would suggest giving it a try, because like it's really interesting, and I never found myself going, oh man, I only got to make like 3 or 4 choices. I always felt like I was like really a part of this story.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there was kind of this constant looming anxiety of, okay, when do I get to make a choice? Like, should I be saving now? But
right.
Is this one of those? Because here's the thing: they do present you with choices. It's just not every choice changes the story. Sometimes it's just kind of gives you different dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
So you do have to be kind of mindful of that. Now, when it does matter, it's kind of obvious, at least in hindsight. But you do get to make some dialogue choices here and there that are just for the sake of additional flavor text. But the story only branches in so many different ways, and honestly, the idea of 27 endings, that just sounds overwhelming. So I'm kind of glad I started with this one. So a core concept throughout the entire game, and especially in the puzzles and stuff, I mentioned it earlier, is the idea of a digital root. So I looked it up. This is not something they invented.
Right.
Which I was a little surprised by. But so what the digital root is if you add all of the digits of a number together, that's what you get. So like the digital root of 200, let's say 216. So you add 1 to 6 to get 7, then you add 2 to 7 to get 9.
You keep doing it until you get a 1-digit number.
Yeah, until you get a 1-digit number. And so the digital root is a really important concept. Many of the puzzles are about arranging things in such a way that you get a digital root of a certain value. And like I mentioned, the doors themselves, you have only people whose numbers add up to a digital root of the number painted on the door can go through the door. And they play with this in quite a few ways. Like, they get into like hexadecimal and stuff even.
Yeah, there's some pretty interesting stuff how I think that's one of the things that I'm maybe most impressed with the game in general is how difficult it must have been to come up with so many different clever ways of using their interesting number system and stuff to create scenarios. Now, it might be that they just worked backwards from where they wanted the story or the scenarios to go and just figured out the details after that or whatever. I don't know. But I am consistently impressed with how it's like, once they explain something after it's happened, you go, oh, that does make sense. Like, that worked out with the numbers. Like, I personally might not have sat there long enough to figure out those numbers, but like, it actually does work. They didn't just, like I said, they didn't just make this up for this game. It is an actual concept, and so to like actually make it fit to where the characters have the right numbers, to like send the characters into rooms together in groups so that you get these different character interactions and stuff that you wouldn't get otherwise, is really clever. It's truly interesting. Again, another way that this whole like branching storylines and the way this game works allows for you to learn more about characters than you would in other stories, because necessarily the teams that you can have go into a room come down to like a handful of teams that are like a big mishmash of teams. It's like, just because you want to go with the cute girl and the cool guy, you can't sometimes,
Yeah, so the digital roots, I mentioned puzzles. I've mentioned them a few times. So what do these puzzles look like? Do you like escape rooms? Because you're going to be doing a lot of escape rooms. Escape rooms I find it fascinating because I'm pretty sure escape rooms, like, they must have existed before this game came out, but I'm pretty sure they didn't really, they got really popular at some point in, I want to say the early 2010s.
Yeah, somewhere around there, which is interesting because when you really think about it, escape rooms are just the physical manifestation of old point-and-click adventure games. So that again, you get into this this interesting idea of what actually constitutes it being a game or what doesn't, and how like really all goes back to like Myst.
Yeah, but so I find it kind of interesting that they were ahead of the curve there. But yeah, so you get locked in a room at certain points in the story, and there's a door that you have to get through, and you have to solve a bunch of puzzles to open the door. And sometimes it's just to get a key, sometimes you need to get figure out a password, and it's usually there's a few steps involved in it. And so you have to go poking through the room and rifling through the drawers or whatever, and then you'll find, oh well, if I stick this this weirdly shaped object into this other object that has a slot in it, then this card pops out or whatever. A lot of stuff like that. So it's it's a lot of it is very clearly intended to be just a puzzle. It's set up in such a way where it's puzzles for puzzle's sake. But hey, this is a weird sort of Saw anime death ship, so why not?
Yeah, there's very occasionally there will be story things that you kind of at least ideas about the story that they're trying to reconfirm or reinforce with some of the puzzles and stuff like that. But for the most part, they're pretty much just yeah, for some reason to open this door, you have to play a child's puzzle game, or something. And a lot of the difficulty of the puzzles themselves actually tend to be with just not having clicked on the right thing at the right time and missing that it even exists in it, entirely. Wait, is that background over there that I can click on, or is it a curtain I can move?
Yeah, I do. Some games, point and click games, have the you can hold down the key to see all of the clickable items highlighted, and I kind of wish they had that here.
Yeah, they definitely seem to have actually relied on that ambiguity to increase the difficulty, because even that first puzzle, you get a set of numbers and you're oh, okay, this clearly goes in here, but why are they different colors? I don't quite get that. And then you search the whole, it doesn't work. You can't use the numbers you got. Or I think they were arrows actually. But anyway, you can't use them, and then you spend another 5 minutes just wandering around that room clicking on things until you finally find, oh, there's a secret hidden thing here that I didn't know was there, and I just hadn't rubbed my mouse cursor on enough objects, and now I found it. Now everything makes sense.
But yeah, I would say overall, the puzzles were quite fun to solve. There weren't many puzzles that I looked at where it's really, that's just dumb. All pretty logical, and if there were a few where it's okay, this has got to be some really crazy cipher, and then I found out that no, I just needed to explore more to find the thing to decode it.
Exactly, right.
But the other thing I found really interesting is because you're expected to go through parts of the story multiple times, the puzzles actually, once you know how to solve them, they don't take much time to get through.
Yeah, you can just fly back through them fairly quickly and easily, which is pretty cool. A lot of them, like I say, you're oftentimes looking for some secret hidden part of the room to get information that you need. But if you're writing stuff down, you can just fly through some of these puzzles when you're going through them for a second time, because a lot of times, obviously the combination for things doesn't change between gameplays. Mm-hmm. And so you can actually quite easily just skip an entire puzzle if you already know the password to the final thing that the key's in or whatever. And in fact, in Virtue's Last Reward, the sequel, they even actually have a whole note-taking thing pulled up for you to write down things, because of course it was on the DS originally.
I think so that one was 3DS actually, but same difference.
Oh, okay, yeah, same difference. But so that you could keep track of information, and I think it persisted between branching storylines and stuff, that you could still pull that stuff up so that you could keep it around, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, and in this game I just used the screenshot feature to hold up the notes, because that is one of the problems, is that the interface in this game isn't great.
Yes.
And because it has the different options, different menus in each of the four corners. So opening up a menu, sometimes you can't open up like your notes menu to check your notes while you're in the puzzle. So you have to like back out of the puzzle and then open the notes and then get back into the puzzle screen.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of things like that where you can tell that it having been a DS game and then coming out of that, there was like things that they relied on the touchscreen for that would have made it very quick to do. But if you don't have a touchscreen, even a mouse, it's not as fast at being like, all right, back out of that.
Well, it's not even just the mouse; it's the size of the screen. It's one of those things where you really start to appreciate like the size of the device you're playing on actually has an impact on how you can design a UI. Because like on the DS, each of the four corners, one, you're going to be spending most of your time in the center of the screen, so it makes sense to put those off to like the furthest points from the center as possible. But secondly, it's really easy to move your hand from one corner of the screen to the next on a DS because that screen is like, what, 3.2 inches across?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it is one of those things where the UI, honestly, in this game isn't that great. You might want to learn how to play with the hotkeys.
I tell you what, definitive way to play this game. Get yourself a Steam Deck. Play it on there. It's got the touch screen that still works for things. It's got all the buttons, so no matter what your play style, you've got everything right there at your fingertips. You can switch back and forth between the play styles. Screen's still obviously way bigger than a DS, but it's still way smaller than having to move your mouse all the way across a full computer screen that's like 30 inches or whatever. It's pretty cool on the Steam Deck. I'm a big proponent of Steam Deck nowadays, by the way.
Oh, okay. So anyway, before we move on, do you have a favorite puzzle?
I really found the medical room interesting with like finding the different parts of the cadaver mannequin thing, putting it together, cool. And then the gambling like room with the cards and stuff was interesting. Both of those like kind of stood out to me comparatively to a lot of the other rooms, because a lot of the other rooms are just like, yeah, no, this is just like a room in a ship or whatever. And some of those had like, those ones kind of had like a interesting vibe to me. I'm sure there were other ones that like if you were to mention them, I would be like, oh yeah, no, that one was really cool. But like the ones that were really different, I appreciated, and that had different kinds of puzzles and stuff.
Okay, so my favorite, and I'm sure anyone who's played the game is probably going to suspect that I'm a serial killer when I say this, but my favorite puzzle was the one down in the cargo hold where you have to put like the keys in the little slots. You have like a 3x3 grid, and you have these numbered little keys, and you have to put the keys in so that they, like tic-tac-toe style, every combination adds up to 9. And I'm sure people, because that's one of the hardest ones to like just memorize and brute force. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be like, why did you like that? That's insane. No person should like that. But it got the programmer juices in my brain flowing, because it's like there's got to be a way that I can simplify this. And then I like made I wrote out like a little chart of, okay, which keys cannot appear on the same line as each other, and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, well, if this has this on this line, that disqualifies it, which means that this has to go on this other line. And so it started getting me thinking in this very sort of like combinatorial logic, trying to figure out how to simplify the problem as much as possible. And I really enjoyed that process.
Very algebraic.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's one of the things too, is that like there's a lot of different types of puzzles in these games, and so like if you just like all puzzles, you're definitely going to have a blast. But there's definitely a puzzle for everyone in this. There's all different styles. There are some of them that will make you feel really smart if you just like know a little bit about something specific randomly, or if you track down. A lot of them are more investigative, so if you feel like you've really done a good job of like searching the room and stuff. But yeah, there's some of them that are just like mind puzzles, obviously, where you're doing essentially math or logicking something out or something, and they're pretty interesting. And then we should point out that during the escape rooms, you oftentimes actually still get interactions with the other characters based on what you're doing, and there's usually some cool cool interactions with them as well.
Yeah, and there's a lot of like just flavor text as well. So it's kind of like doing an investigation in the Ace Attorney series. You'll click on something and you'll get a conversation where people will make like a little joke, and that's where a lot of the games like humor and little more subtle character interactions occur.
Yeah, because the characters aren't likely to like joke around. Like you say, it's not like a typical anime sort of setup, and so the characters aren't likely to like make light of whenever somebody has like literally just died or something like that, which is a lot of the conversations is like you all meet in a room and somebody's just found a dead body or you're trying to figure out what's going on or whatever, and so the characters are taking things seriously. It's in the puzzles where characters will just make funny little like dad jokes and stuff about things that you found and things like that, and you get like a better feel for the characters and who they are like on a normal day, on a Tuesday instead of on a murder cruise that was set up by a psychopath.
Yeah. All right, so I think we've exhausted the gameplay discussion as much as we can, or at least as much as I can with having not played the game in a few weeks.
Right.
So let's move on to the presentation. So the music in this game is... So it does a really good job of establishing the tense atmosphere, but man, there are some songs here that are like really just kind of get stuck in your head. I don't mean like earworm kind of stuck in your head. Like it just sort of, it kind of digs its claws into some primal part of your brain,
Yeah, no, there's some real bops in here that like do a really good job of setting the tone, and they're still enjoyable. And, some of these puzzles, for instance, you're in there for like 20 minutes, whatever, trying to figure out the puzzle, and there's just like some soft spooky music in the background, kind of techno-y or something like that. And
yeah, this
like
is
you
a
say,
very, like, if you are at all nostalgic for the Nintendo DS, this is like, I remember going back and listening to some of these songs, and it's like, this is a very Nintendo DS song.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
It's very emblematic of what was popular in video games at that time. While still being its own thing. Let me make that clear. It's still its own thing. It's very much its own thing.
But you don't get super tired of hearing the songs, even though like you're in one room working on a puzzle for a while or anything. It does a good job. And I'm not going to sit here and say that it's it should be like an award-winning soundtrack or anything. There's a couple of songs here or there, like you say, some of the like credits sort of songs and stuff like that were pretty cool. But like it just does a good job of setting tone, and they're enjoyable, and like you kind of feel it, but they're not irritating songs.
Yeah, I was kind of disappointed that I couldn't find the soundtrack for sale, at least digitally. I think, that's the problem with a lot of these games, is that the soundtrack was sold on CD in Japan.
Right. Yes.
But, it's been over 10 years since this game came out, so good luck finding that for a good price. But yeah, it's there's a lot of just I have this like category that I call thinking music. That is, Ace Attorney has a lot of that for like trial themes or the investigation themes, and there's a lot of good thinking music in here where you can just kind of put it in the background as you're trying to work through a problem.
Yeah, it's kind of like study music or work music if you're like you are a programmer or something like that. Things where you need to be able to think and hear yourself talk to yourself in your own head, but you still need something that's like keeping your attention kind of focused in on what you're really doing. So it's good stuff. I really appreciate the sound design in these games in general. Like, again, very impressive and interesting for a Nintendo DS game. And like you say, it is very, very emblematic of the time period of the DS. But because very few games on the DS had like a tense, like spooky, more adult sort of feel to them, it is very unique among a lot of those games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd say probably my favorite song in the soundtrack is the one that plays when I think it's called like Riddle and Logic on the soundtrack, and it's that really kind of creepy droning song that plays when the characters start talking about the conspiracy nonsense.
Yeah, I remember that too. That one is actually a really cool one, and that was when that one started playing. You were like, "Oh, the stuff's getting real." Like we're going to talk about some of the really interesting stuff in the storyline, and we did. I guess when we get into like the actual story discussion section, we'll probably get into some more of the nitty gritty. But like, I do appreciate how, in general, the story tended to touch on like both real history and science, and then pseudoscience and their own mythology, and made you kind of feel like you were in like you were constantly questioning, wait, did that really happen? Was that a real thing? Like, wait, what?
Yeah, and that the song really sells that mood. It's the sort of thing that I played a lot of this at night, and it's sort of like, oh gosh, I'm now kind of on edge. I'm not sure I should have played that so late at night.
Absolutely. It's not like spooky, but it is like it like piques your interest and like puts you just a little on edge and has you like ready to react,
Yeah, it's kind of that late night History Channel kind of spooky, not the not horror movie spooky.
Yeah, you got the crazy hair guy saying aliens.
Yeah. But so in the audio department, this game also, at least in the re-releases, the non-rare game collection release, has voice acting, and many of these actors are quite experienced. I think what is her name? Wendy Lee played Clover.
Yeah.
And that was like really weird for me, because it's like, I know that voice. Why do I know that voice? Like, I recognize that voice. But who is that? And I had to like go look it up, and then it's like, oh, she was basically in every anime I ever watched. No wonder why I recognized it.
Right, yeah. That was definitely... The voice acting was really good, and, like, I didn't recognize every single character, but the ones that I did, like, I appreciated their actors and their take on these characters, and like... There was no phoning in. I don't think any of these characters were poorly voice acted. Like,
so I would say that I think Junpei has a few odd line readings, and I would say that's actually kind of true of the entire cast, at least in like the first half of the game. But like Junpei, his voice actor from one line to the next will sometimes kind of oscillate in tone. Like, he'll sound kind of freaked out at one point, and then he'll have a line that's like, oh, okay. And he says it very casually.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, there are some like, tone issues here or there, I feel like.
I think that to me, I don't really know a whole lot about how voice acting is recorded, but what little I do know, I don't think that's necessarily the actor's fault. I think that's poor direction.
Correct. That would absolutely be a direction error, because, you never know if they decided one of those lines needed to be, like, slotted in, like, a month later, Like, especially with voice acting, it doesn't matter if you record that line yesterday, today, or 3 weeks from now. It can be slotted in anywhere, and so it has to be up to the director to be like, okay, remember, this is what's going on in the scene, this is what you should be sounding like. This is going to come right after this line, so you should be trying to remember, what you sounded like when you said that, and so, yeah, it would come down mostly to direction, because the lines themselves still feel like they have a lot of, like, emotion to them, and
there are no wooden performances. There is there's no really bad acting. There's nothing like that.
Exactly. It's just that some of the lines, sometimes you're like, I don't know if they told him what scene this was going to be in when they told him to read that line, like.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's not so out of place where it just becomes comical. It's just sort of like kind of that one that moment that sort of makes your eyebrow raise just a hair.
Right. But comparatively to a lot of anime things, again, like it's pretty great, because the characters aren't acting like super over the top, and they're not like super out of character all the time or anything. There's moments here or there where they act like maybe a little weird or something, but it's fairly believable that real people would act the way being voice acted. Whereas in plenty of anime, even when it is some sort of like murder game or something, the characters are being giant goofballs and overacting, and their heads are getting big and they're yelling at each other and stuff. Like
yeah, or you have kind of like the JoJo way of doing things where they're like kind of melodramatic.
Right, yeah, it's like it all feels completely Shakespearean all the time.
Yeah. But yeah, overall, the voice acting I think was quite good, and it is interesting that they went back and added voice acting for the re-release, because they could have very easily just left it out. The original game didn't have it.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is especially interesting with the fact that this is one thing we haven't really mentioned at any point yet, and it is partially good to save at least part of this discussion for the conversation. But there's an internal monologue and they call it narration and adventure mode, I think is what it is.
I think novel and adventure mode.
Novel and adventure. And so when you're on novel, it's like a narrator is explaining what's happening.
Yeah, it reads like a book. Mode, so, like if you have Junpei call out to someone, it's like, "Hey guys, over here." In adventure mode, you'll just see the sprite on screen and hear the voice line, "Hey guys, over here," and they'll respond to it. In novel mode, it'll be like, "Hey guys, over here," Junpei exclaimed, or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Right, and the novel part is not voice acted. I mean, obviously, if it's like Junpei talking, it still is, but the little narrations between and around it aren't. And on the DS, you would actually see the novel narration on the bottom screen and the adventure narration on the top screen in two different colors.
Yeah, and I thought it was so weird that they gave me that option. Like, I only discovered that option like about maybe halfway through my playthrough, and then when I read after I played it that, that was for the DS. One screen had one, and the other had the other version of the events. It's like, oh, okay. There are just so many places where, like, seriously, after you play this game, if you do decide to play it, go look up the differences between the DS version and later versions, because it's really interesting. Even some of the puzzles are different.
Yeah, it's truly interesting, and we'll get into like a couple of interesting differences between the American and Japanese release as well whenever we get to story, because there's at least one that I thought was just like pretty cool, actually.
Okay. I'm not sure I know what you're talking about, so I look forward to hearing that. Yeah, so let's talk about the visual style as well. The visuals in visual novels. So a lot of this is going to be kind of just static character poses and backgrounds. And actually, let's talk about the backgrounds first, because it's very clear to me that the backgrounds are like... It's weirdly nostalgic for me seeing the background art, because it's not hand-drawn. It's like a bunch of 3D renders, pre-rendered backgrounds from different camera angles. That way they could like build it in a 3D modeling program once and then just move the camera around.
Yeah, it definitely has kind of that PlayStation 1, like Final Fantasy 7, like the backgrounds are like high detailed renders that like they discovered in the files that there were 4K versions of those. But anyway, like back then. But anyway,
you mean for Final Fantasy 7?
Yes.
Huh. Well, that explains the 3 discs. I'm
yes,
joking.
Exactly.
The 3 discs are for the cutscenes. Like for Final Fantasy 7, I'm getting off topic as I always do. But for Final Fantasy 7, the entire game fits on 1 disc. It's just that the full motion cutscenes require 2 additional discs.
Exactly. But yeah, it definitely like calls back to those sorts of time periods, which I always loved the DS for being kind of like the handheld Nintendo 64.
Yeah, and it like the character sprites also kind of look like they're from the Nintendo 64 as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels so much like playing Magic School Bus games at the library whenever in the 90s, with like the animations of the animated characters moving, and I don't know. It's just great. I love it.
Yeah, the character art looks really good, and like I said, it has this weird. I can't put my finger on it. It's driving me crazy, but it has this weird quality that makes it kind of feel like it's from sort of like the late '90s. Well, like I said, the backgrounds certainly help because they're pre-rendered 3D backgrounds, but they're not the highest quality.
Right.
Even for the time, I think they were a little bit. So they have that kind of slightly smooth, plasticky look.
Yeah, absolutely. And the character artwork is really good. My only complaint, honestly, is Lotus's outfit, as you have mentioned before. That's at number 8. Her outfit seemed entirely unnecessary, and obviously they were just like, it's rated M. Let's just cram a lady in here who's almost naked, just because they felt like it. But
yeah, but with the character art, there is just sort of like between the way the colors look and the shading and how animated it is with like how smooth the animation is and how not smooth it is at times. It does remind me a lot of like the few N64 games that had like character sprites like that.
Yeah. They in the 90s, there was this weird way that animation would move on the N64 and on I brought it up, but like I remember so many of the like point and click like educational games that I played at the library in the 90s had animation that moved really similar to that too. It's very, very nostalgic. and the characters themselves all have like a pretty good look where again it sort of lends itself to some of that like anime sort of vibe.
Yeah, like some of their outfits are kind of ridiculous. Like number 2, they call him Snake because Snake Eyes 2. Anyway.
Yeah.
And there's actually an additional layer to that because this isn't a spoiler. He's blind, and snakes don't have very good vision either. Though I don't think they bring attention to that in his code name.
Yeah, I think really you're just supposed to notice that it's specifically eyes are part of the description, and therefore it works. But yeah, you find that out the first time that dude talks.
Snakes have bad eyesight, don't they? Or am I thinking of something else?
No, snakes do, because they actually mostly move off of smell, and they do most of the smell with their tongue, I think, which is why they're always sticking their tongue out and tasting the air. But yeah, the characters have slightly ridiculous outfits, but at the same time, like, none of them are, like, super tropey, like, anime outfits either, and so you're, except for
like,
Lotus.
What was her name? Number 6. They call her June in the game because June's the 6th month of the year. She like the way she's dressed. Outside of like the way she does her hair is a little bit or like more ornate than I think any person would reasonably do on a daily basis. Her outfit looks very just normal.
Yeah, and I've dressed like Junpei before, pretty much, except for I don't have a fluffy vest. But I mean, he was pretty much just dressed like Michael J. Fox from Back to the Future.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's an actual reference. I could see it being a reference, honestly.
Yeah. But all right. So, is there anything else you want to say about the visuals?
No, I don't think so. It's really good. Well, I will say that they do a good job of when there is like something kind of gruesome or something, like it being off camera just enough that it's not like super over the top or anything, and it gives it actually a creepier feel a lot of times when it's just like, oh, there's just some blood on the wall and everybody's freaking out, like.
Well, and they do give some descriptions in novel mode, not so much adventure mode, so I was spared most of the lurid details. But yeah, it is one of those things where they don't really show gore. They show blood. There is lots of blood in this game, but they don't really show the viscera or the mangled body or anything.
Right, and it's like normally what you actually see is just like, here's some blood here, and then it cuts to one of the characters.
There are dead bodies in this game.
Yeah, people die in this game, and some people may have
die in the death games.
Yeah, there may even already be some dead people when the story starts. We don't even know. But yeah, and then like they'll cut to just like the reaction of the people, and their reaction tells the story as well or better than just you seeing like a gross mangled corpse or something would actually. Like it sells it well, and so that does fit into the visual department of this game, and I thought was really well done.
Okay, so with all that out of the way, now let's talk about spoilers. And so I'm going to divide this into a brief discussion of each of the characters. Like I said, it is very character driven. And then we'll talk about the story more broadly. So first of all, let's talk about our main character, Junpei.
All right, yeah, Junpei is, like you said at the beginning, a college student. One of the things getting into characters and spoilers is that all of these characters are kind of more or less connected to each other in some way. Junpei actually weirdly being probably the most separate character to all of them, except for his major connections to Akane.
Mm-hmm.
So when you first show up in the game, you meet Akane, and it becomes clear that Junpei...
And for the record, for those of you who haven't played the game, Akane... Well, if you haven't played the game, first of all, shame on you for listening to the spoiler section. But secondly, Akane is June's real name, and that actually is not a spoiler. So you still have you still have a chance to get out.
Still
now.
have time.
Yeah, you
Right.
still have time because they start off by calling her Akane, and then the code name comes later. But
Right. Although Junpei only refers to her as Akane in his own head, I should point out. So Junpei, who is number 5, sees Akane, who is number 6, and it becomes clear that he knows her. But other than that, he seems fairly detached from all the other characters, which is kind of interesting, because he is entirely integral to the story, but a lot of these other characters have like a lot in common with each other and things bouncing off of each other, and Junpei seems fairly separate. So that's kind of his thing, is that it's clear that he has feelings or had feelings that are becoming rekindled with Akane. And so as soon as he realized that she's here, they used to be like elementary school friends. As soon as he realizes that she's here, his motivation in the story essentially just becomes, I'll pretty much do anything to protect her.
yeah, one of the things I like about Junpei is that he is not a complete dithering wuss. Because I know it's very common in visual novels to make the male hero just kind of a wimp, you know?
Yeah, no.
And he's not super strong. He's not a super tough guy by any means. You know, he's not Giga Chad alpha male type, but
Right.
he definitely is like willing to stand up to people and call them out when they do something stupid.
Yeah, and he's like his strength actually is that he's very clever. Essentially, like there are definitely other characters in it that are more, that you would say probably have a higher IQ than him or more well educated or something. But when push comes to shove, he does seem to be able to outsmart a lot of the other characters, and sometimes in like vaguely nefarious ways, which is interesting for a hero character, because he does definitely have this like heroic quality to him. He's definitely willing to stand up against evil. He's not. It doesn't seem like he's like willing to make...
He wants everyone to get out alive if possible.
Yeah, it doesn't look like he's willing to make sacrifices or anything, but he doesn't like stand on principle all the time either. There definitely are a couple of story beats where, for instance, you essentially just like trick the entire group for his own his own purposes, which obviously ends up working out well for everyone. Theoretically in the end game when you get the true ending, but or mostly everyone, but like it's still like there's for instance a moment where he just like slams his hand on one of these doors and gets himself in the queue for being in the door and pits a couple of people against each other to come in with him. And when it's happening, you're like, wow, that was kind of cutthroat actually. And then like one of the other characters gets in there. I think it's number 3, which is Santa. He gets in there, and you leave 2 characters behind, and they know that they're just trapped there because there's only 2 of them who are going to be going through the door. There's only 2 of them, and the way the doors work, there has to be 3, and so they're just stuck. And you're kind of wondering, whoa, did Junpei just like abandon them and they're gonna die now? And that doesn't really end up.
Technically, that ending or that event isn't canon because it isn't on the critical path for the good ending. But yeah,
right. But yeah, it's truly interesting because he's not a dumb anime protagonist that's just all heroics and super stupid. He's a smart anime protagonist who is still a good guy, but is like willing to like deceive the other people occasionally for, you know, kind of the greater good sort of thing.
And like I said, a lot of times you would imagine the main character in these kind of stories being sort of spineless, so that the writer can just have the other characters shuffle them around. And that's not the case here either. Like, you know, like he's
no, not at all.
Said he's willing to get devious if he has to.
Yeah, which is truly cool because it really makes you do feel like you have more agency than you would in that scenario. You know, like if he's just getting shoved around and just doing whatever the other characters want him to, then you wouldn't feel like you're in control of the story. But because Junpei tends to be intelligent and kind of know what's going on and being willing to deceive the other people occasionally and is willing to take chances and risks as long as it means that he can get everyone out and protect Akane, he's okay with it. But he is still, like, it seems to be like a caring person, right? Like you said, he wants everyone out alive, and he like really makes connections with a lot of these characters and like becomes like sort of like a rock that they can rely on in certain situations and stuff.
Yeah. So moving on from there, let's go in numerical order from here on out. You know, I had to do the main character first. But,
right.
So number 1, codename Ace. And Ace he's an older character. He has a very kind of statesman-like, sort of almost fatherly aspect to him. And I remember playing the game, I started out thinking, you know, I really like this guy. And then the more I played, the more I thought, I like this guy too much.
Yeah, absolutely. He has like, when you first meet him, before they give people code names and no one's introduced themselves, they actually have, like, kind of pseudo code names already.
Like, the dialogue box shows what Junpei, how he's mentally categorizing them, which I thought was pretty cool. So, what did they call him? Like, Lion?
Lion, yeah, because he had this sort of like regal lionish look. He had like kind of like the hair and stuff that was kind of like a mane. And I love that voice actor. I can't remember like what else he's done, but like,
he's phenomenal job on him.
Yeah, and I too was like, this guy's cool, and then they rug pull that real hard, like, and that's one of the cool things that the story does. Like, he ends up being one of the worst human beings. Actually, I think he is the worst human being in this entire story.
Yeah. So to spoil it, because this is the spoiler section, you have been warned.
Yes,
he's actually the CEO of a pharmaceutical company, and he was doing a bunch of he was involved in like some non-honorary games that happened 9 years ago, because of course it was 9 years ago.
Yes.
Where he ran some children through this exact scenario to try to figure out if precognition was, or like telepathy was actually a thing.
Yeah, I think it kind of has to do with like Jungian philosophy of like the collective unconsciousness.
Oh, okay, cool.
So his concept is that if you put people, especially who have a close relationship together, into these like horrible, dangerous situations, that their consciousness will actually connect over space. You know, so he set up these death games for little kids who had twins and like split them up and put them in separate like locations so that he could put them through horrible death games and force them to connect with each other psychically. And the whole crux of the idea, and this is like, I bring this up sometimes just in casual conversation because it's hilarious and ridiculous, is that this dude has face blindness, which is a real condition. Prosopagnosia.
Yeah, I thought it was paraprognosia.
Maybe so, but this guy has face blindness, and the whole purpose of putting these children through death games is he's hoping that if he can psychically connect with other people, he'll be able to recognize their freaking faces, and it's hilarious, and it's stupid, and it's horrifying.
Yeah, and I love, while we're on the subject, I love how Junpei, at one point in the story, where he's trying to do some deductions on something that happened previously. A character was murdered, and he's trying to figure out who did it, and he concludes that was Ace, and he uses the paraprognosia as evidence because the character was dressed up like another character when he died, so Ace couldn't recognize him. Because he couldn't recognize his face, he just used his clothing. But the thing I love about it is he says, oh, so what? You think just because I have face blindness that automatically makes me an evil person? That's called prejudice, Junpei, and that's wrong. And he's like, yeah, no, I'm not saying you're evil because you have paraprognosia. It turns out he's evil because he has paraprognosia.
Okay, I've looked it up. It's prosopagnosia. So it's prosopagnosia.
Prosopagnosia?
Yeah, so we were both just a little off.
Okay. My apologies to the none of you who have that who are listening to this.
Yes. Yeah, you're being really prejudiced to them, and you're only allowed to do that if they put a bunch of children into death games, Glenn. Yeah, it's quite weird, honestly. And that's one of those things that we kind of mentioned just in passing before, that they slip in these things that are real scientific things and real medical conditions and stuff, but they have ridiculous names, and you've never heard of them before. And...
Well, actually, I did know about face blindness because it. I don't want to go into too much detail because it's a spoiler for another game, but there is an Ace Attorney case where one of the characters has it.
Right. Apparently, it's more common in Japan and Korea, I've read, which is interesting. But my sister has pointed out that there have been actually multiple K-dramas that she watches that characters have face blindness. But yeah, when I said you, I actually meant the royal you.
Oh, okay.
You the player. But yeah, they do this good job of, they slip in weird concepts that you may have heard of or you may not have, and then pseudoscience ones, and so you're just constantly like, wait, is this real or is this part of this story? And that's definitely one of them, when they say this term and you're like, what? And then you realize it's face blindness, and then you're like, you pull out your phone and you're looking it up and you're like, wow, that's a real thing, interesting. And then you realize that it was like apparently the crux of like everything, because again, obviously we are well into spoiler territory. He did this to these kids back in the day, and now this version of the Nonary games that he's in now is put on by other characters because he did it to them in the past.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's Ace, and yeah, probably one of my favorite characters in the game, even if he turns out to be a snake. So let's talk about Snake. Let's move on to the guy who's actually called Snake, and Snake is not a snake. He is, he's actually a pretty cool guy, and I would say he's possibly the most anime of all the characters.
Yeah, definitely. He wears like a Prince outfit.
Yeah, and he's got that anime cool guy, sort of I'm the smart guy kind of demeanor.
And to be honest, I actually pegged him as kind of a bad guy at first, and then grew to really like him a whole lot as the story went on. He was the opposite of Ace.
Mm-hmm.
So... yeah, he has like a ridiculous outfit that looks like a prince. It's the code name they give him at the beginning before he actually comes out and says that he'll go with Snake Eyes because he's blind, and that stands for 2 because he has the 2 bracelet, whatever. And yeah, he just slowly becomes a more likable character. He's actually related to one of the other characters in the story, which is number 4, which is Clover, who you mentioned just briefly before because you mentioned her voice actor. And his actual like... he and his sister's like dynamic is an enjoyable one because they like really seem to care about each other a ton, and they're just interesting characters in general.
Yeah. Now the sad thing about Snake though is that he's not present throughout a huge chunk of the story though,
right?
Because he gets exploded about halfway through, gets shoved into a room, and then the bomb goes off. But surprise, that actually wasn't him. As I mentioned before, Ace thought Snake thought he saw Snake because the guy that he shoved in the room was wearing Snake's clothes, and
he didn't recognize him because of his face blindness.
Yeah. And so he's not there for a lot of the story, but he does come back in the end. And
in the true ending, you discover him in a coffin that he's been locked into, and he's wearing a different outfit. But like, you truly believe he's like legit dead for most of the game, in most of the endings, and so does everyone else.
Yeah, and that's one of those things where it's when you see the body of what you believe to be Snake, they mention his left arm being like, the bones sticking out of it or something. And I remember thinking that's a weird detail to go to bring up specifically. Like, not just saying, oh, the bones are sticking out of his arm, but the bones are sticking out of his left arm. That's oddly specific.
Right.
And then, when Clover, way later in the game, mentions in an optional conversation, that you have to listen to get the good ending. So it's not really optional. He's missing his left arm. It's prosthetic.
Yeah, he's in like a car wreck or something, and so he had one fake arm, and so
which does not seem to hinder his ability to move it, because I see look at the way he poses and stuff. I don't remember him posing weird with that.
No, absolutely not. However, this is set, like the original Nonary games were in 2018, so these ones would have been 2027. So we're still 4 years out. Maybe they'll have robot arms then.
Oh, okay. I did not realize that this was a near future setting.
Yeah, I believe so. When I was like kind of researching some of the finer details, if I remember correctly, it said that the original Nonary games, the ones that Ace put on, were in 2018. So
interesting. Okay.
So yeah, that does end up being really important because we'll get to Clover eventually, but some of the endings include Clover going completely wackadoodles crazy and killing everyone because her brother died, and so
or she thought her brother died.
Exactly. So proving that her brother isn't dead to her is extremely important to the stories. And this is one of those situations that I was legitimately talking about earlier whenever I mentioned how putting these characters in different situations allows you to get to know the characters better than you would in a single timeline, because...
Yeah, well, and there is kind of an inverse situation, because there's an ending where Clover gets murdered and Snake goes completely ballistic.
Yeah, these characters really care about each other. So, we can go ahead and move on to number 3 before we talk too much about number 4. But
yeah. And so number 3 is Santa, and Santa, gosh darn it, I hate the reasoning behind his name, because apparently it's based on the fact that San is Japanese for 3,
right? And
then he just decided to added, I don't know, maybe it's something that made more sense in the Japanese version.
Yeah, I imagine it is, because then his whole thing is that he then has a story about the 2 Santas, which I'm assuming he's kind of referencing Santa and Krampus, but then the good Santa kills the bad Santa and gets his blood all over his clothes, which is why the white Santa has a red costume.
Yeah, and so there were a lot of the stories where I looked up and it's like, is this actually a thing? And that one I didn't even bother. It's like, that's stupid. I don't want that to be real.
Yeah, as far as I know, that one's entirely made up. But, they clearly had to somehow get to Santa somehow, and they wanted to tell that story because that somehow played into his sort of like, is he a good person or is he a bad person kind of dichotomy.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing about Santa is that, he kind of looks like a bit of a punk, and throughout the entire story, he's abrasive, but then he'll have moments where he's like defensive towards characters, so you never really quite can get a beat on like who he is as a person throughout the entire game. You're not entirely sure if you can trust him.
Yeah, he definitely plays kind of the Lancer role towards Junpei, where you kind of get that, like, they're kind of closer in age than a lot of the other characters are to Junpei, and they don't exactly get along, but, like, they're kind of on the same page in some cases, and they kind of bounce off of each other well in an interesting way. Where Junpei is like a little more, it seems at least that Junpei is more like analytical and Santa is more like hot-headed and just wants to like get in there and do stuff. It's an interesting dynamic. That's probably one of the more anime-y sort of characters, at least on the surface.
Yeah.
But his character turns out is actually part of this Nonary game. He's the assistant to Zero and is all tied up in it. And again, it's all because he was in the previous Nonary games that Ace put on. And so he really does have like a lot of interesting character stuff going on behind the scenes that you really don't understand at all until you get the true ending. So a second playthrough is kind of interesting when you're looking at him, because you start to understand what's going on with him a lot more as you go, oh, okay, like he's in on this, but he's also like not actually evil, but he does constantly question if he's a bad person for being in on this, right? And that's why the whole good Santa, bad Santa thing is like a part of his character, is that he's doing this for his sister because he has to in order to save his sister. And so does that make him a bad person for putting all of these people through this horrible situation? Or is he a good person because he's not trying to hurt anyone really, and he's kind of just bringing justice to the people that put them through it the first time and simultaneously saving his sister's life?
Right. All right, so moving on, next is Clover, and we've already talked a little bit about Clover, but the first thing I want to mention about Clover is, did you know she's 18?
Yes, I remember that being said at some point. I think they specifically wanted to make sure that no one in the game was under 18 because it's mature and they're all cute anime characters and stuff, so they figured they just cut that off at the pass and not have any children, even if they look like children.
Yeah, I thought she was like 15 or 16 or something throughout the entire game. So, there's this one scene where Junpei's trying to have a conversation with her while during one of the puzzles, and so he sends Ace, is like, okay, Ace, could you go into the other room and start looking for clues in there? And then Ace comes back in, and like Junpei is like, Ace, I told you to be in the other room, and he kind of looks at Junpei and Clover and goes, I think I see what's going on here.
Yeah.
When I first saw that, it's like, what? No, she is a child. What? Why would you think that?
Yeah, and that's the exact type of thing that I'm saying. They purposefully made her exactly 18 so that they could kind of have sort of that, she's definitely young and sweet and innocent sort of vibe to her, but then still say, no, she's technically an adult though, so you don't have to worry about it. And we don't.
Well, there are three sides to her character. So there's the sweet, bubbly anime girl version. Then there is the melancholy, I think my brother is dead. And then there's the, well, if my brother's dead, I'm going to kill everyone else. Acts crazy. Like, literally acts crazy. She finds a fire axe at one point.
Yeah, she finds an axe, and she begins killing people based on... It appears she's just trying to take revenge for the death of her brother, Snake. Because she does some math and tries to figure out who could have opened the door that he went through and died in, and decides that it's 7 and Santa, I believe, so 3 and 7. And so she goes and she murders them while you're not around, and you're like, okay, well, I mean, I guess I see where you're coming from. And then she tells you that she killed Akane, which is 6, or June, because she, quote-unquote, had to go because she got in the way. And then you're like, oh, okay. And then she's like, come with me because I need your wristband to get out the last door. And so she like holds her hand out to Junpei, and like he like is so distraught at like the fact that she's now an axe murderer that he doesn't know what to do, but he goes ahead and starts to go with her, and then she kills him. So like it's not like this like reasoned like revenge thing. It's that she has snapped, and now she is just an all-out axe murderer.
But that's one of the bad endings. She gets better when she finds out that her brother is not dead. So.
Right, and it's truly kind of an interesting concept because, again, like, other stories don't allow for you to see what happens if this character, like, snaps and becomes an axe murderer. And it kind of starts, once you see that ending, it starts to paint kind of your opinion of Clover in general. You're like, are you actually a psychopath and I don't realize it? Like, what's going on here? Like...
Yeah. Well, it's that... That kind of that old thought experiment is like how do each of us have that one thing that could push us over the edge, or multiple things, I suppose.
Yeah, like the Joker with Batman. Like Joker always says, everyone's just one bad day away from being me. So yeah, it's an interesting concept, and like you do feel like, okay, well, like when her brother's alive, she's not a crazy person, and it was the stress of the games themselves plus the murder that pushed her.
Something we should point out is she was actually involved in the previous non-rare games, she and her brother, so there probably was some like PTSD stuff happening in the background.
Yeah, she honestly has probably the worst story. Worst meaning like hers is the hardest story of any of these characters, because this is her second non-rare game. She was really young the first time around, because she would have been 9. She would have been 9. And then of course, her brother dies presumably in this story and stuff, and so there's a lot going on for that poor girl. And she actually, I believe, reappears in one of the later ones. I can't remember which one.
Yeah, she does. And so before we go forward, I guess I need to point out her name, of course, is a reference to a 4-leaf clover because she's number 4.
Right.
And I also believe her actual name is Clover.
I think it is, and there's like an actual reference to her name when Santa gives you a bookmark that has a 4-leaf clover on it. At some point, you have to have gotten that from him and give it to Clover for her to not go crazy, because that like tides her over just long enough for her brother to survive. Yeah, so
something we didn't mention is that some of the endings can only be unlocked if you go through. I guess I made a reference to this. You have to go through the game again and get these little optional conversations, and then like those optional conversations will unlock other optional conversations, or missable conversation perhaps would be a better term, in a later, and these are during the escape room sequences. And those are where it really like start to flesh out the world, and where you get like the weird conspiracy conversations and the like.
Right, and when we get over to the multiple story paths explanation of the story, we'll get in a little bit more to that, but there's like an actual in-universe reason for why playing through the game and getting multiple story endings and stuff actually uncovers new story endings for you, and I think that's really cool.
Anyway, so next up is number 6, June, or Akane, as her actual name is.
Yep, her character is obviously the most important character in the game, because spoiler alerts, this deep into the spoiler alerts section is maybe not that important, but just in case, she's technically the main antagonist, kind of, but Ace is kind of also technically the main antagonist. She was in the original non-rare games with her brother Santa, and she is going to die in that non-rare game, but she's here because you're going to save her across time by the end of this game. We'll get there. It'll make sense, sort of, whenever we talk about it.
Yeah, so you're like cyclically linked to her, and you have to send the solution to. Anyway, we'll get there in a second. But
yeah, but you can't talk about her without mentioning she is Zero, and she's doing this for actually not the worst reasons in the world. She's kind of forced into doing this. And it really all comes down to it's all Ace's fault still. So that's why it's so funny that both Glenn and I, when we saw Ace, we were kind of like, this guy's pretty cool. And then it's like, by the end of it, you're like, oh my goodness, he's not technically the antagonist of this game, but he is absolutely the worst human being here.
Yeah, well, like I said, my opinion of him was like, this guy's pretty cool. I like him. And then after a certain point, I'm like, okay, I like this guy too much. Something's off. But anyway, we're not talking about him anymore. So Akane, right. Yeah, so she is a childhood friend of Junpei, and Junpei had a crush on her. I think she had a crush on him, but they were kids, so they didn't talk about it. And then they went to different schools. And she's also Santa's sister, which is like really weird to me, because it's like, okay, Junpei, this was your best friend in elementary school. So first of all, you didn't know she was an orphan, and secondly, you didn't know she had a brother.
Right.
You expect me to believe that? Like, you typically know your like. Maybe I'm just not understanding how the concept of friendship works, but I could have sworn when I was a kid, I like knew my friends' family situations for the most part, like just at least in general.
Yeah, it could be a cultural thing, for all we know. In Japan, it's like, maybe it's not appropriate to, like, talk about your family to your friends unless they've met them or something. I don't know. But, yeah, you do definitely get this, it plays into Akane's character. Obviously, they have to hide some of it so that you're surprised by it later.
Yeah.
But she has this very damsel in distress, like, completely useless sort of vibe. She has these spells where she, like, falls over and faints and gets a fever and stuff, and you think that's her whole character. She's somewhat intelligent.
Yeah,
but,
she's intelligent, and she's also, like, if Junpei is the I want everyone to get out of this alive if possible, she's the I want everyone to get out of this alive no matter what.
Right. Yeah, she's definitely a caring person, but the truly interesting thing is that because she ends up being Zero, she's the entire crux of the whole story, and it's kind of interesting. It's pretty cool, honestly. Whereas they could have just painted her as, hey, she's just a pretty girl, and Junpei likes her, so he's motivated. Instead, that's what you think it is up until the last 20 minutes of the true ending, essentially.
20 minutes. Wow, you must have been speed reading that, because, man, that true ending takes a while. But
it really does, yeah. I couldn't remember at what point in the true ending they actually finally spill the beans that she's the mastermind. I thought it was pretty late in the story.
Yeah, you might be right about that, but I don't remember. But so my take on her is, up until you find out that the reason for her being the mastermind and all that, I don't like her. I mean, she's cute. Don't get me wrong. She is very pretty. But the thing is, like, I don't like the way where very early on she just, like, gets out of nowhere weirdly flirty with Junpei. Like, in one of the first puzzle rooms you have with her, she, like, makes some sort of comment about getting in the shower together, and it's like, oh, I'm just kidding, or do you want to know how many guys I've dated? And it's just like, Connie, please, we're in a life and death situation. I don't want to be thinking about that right now.
Right. And, there's, that probably is one of the things that falls a little more into, like, the tropey sort of area of it. It just gets a little closer than a lot of the other things. There's also a question of, like, it's weird because since she, through time, knows that you're her, like, true love that is going to save her life, like, there's, like, an extra connection there that you have no way of knowing about until you, again, beat the game. And so, like, maybe there's something going on there to kind of, like, yada yada hand wave that weird behavior away. But, yeah, it's strange.
Yeah.
I think that part pretty much just goes in there because they knew that 18-year-old teenage boys were going to be playing the game and would appreciate it, and that's pretty much it.
Anyway, so next up we have Seven, who is number 7. I think Seven's my favorite character.
Yeah, he's actually one of the most interesting ones, honestly, because, like you said way back at the beginning of this podcast, he looks like he's going to be, like, the dumb, like, brute kind of guy, and maybe even, like, he's going to be trouble, because, like, he's going to get mad and, like, fly off the handle or something. That's more Santa than it is Seven. And Seven turns out to be, like, a really stand-up guy, like, most of the time. Like,
yeah, and you find out he was actually a policeman, detective. He was a detective and kind of the lone wolf type who went after bad guys even when it wasn't politically convenient for the department to do it.
Yeah, they didn't really want him to be stopping this pharmaceutical company because they had lots of power and money and connections. And he went after it anyway, and then he ended up saving all but Akane from this thing. Like, after being drugged, knocked unconscious, put in a cell, he escapes, and he saves all these kids except for Akane.
Yeah, so not only is he an absolute boss, but he also, it kind of explains his character, because at first he sort of he like tries to force open doors and stuff or I think there's one scene early on where he's like, well, maybe we can push this wall down or something. It's like, really, dude?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's because he probably is, like, vaguely aware of, like, how these games work, even if he doesn't remember.
Oh, yeah, that's another thing we should mention, is that he's amnesiac throughout most of the game.
Right, yeah, we should point out he has amnesia, so, like, he maybe kind of has a general idea of, like, like obviously these things are happening in real places, but there is a like game show sort of aspect to it that he's probably somewhat aware of, that he's hoping like maybe some of these walls are fake and they'll just fall right over, or you'll be able to walk right through them or something. But yeah, it doesn't work out that way because it's a pretty well built place, turns out.
Yeah, and then he starts recalling like really specific stuff about ships and the like. And he kind of is dressed like a dock worker, so you think, oh, maybe he just knows that because he works with boats. But you know, you get more and more of these little insights from him. It's like, oh, okay, this guy's he's pretty smart. He's just rough around the edges.
Yeah, he's a very educated dude, actually. Like, he knows a lot of stuff. You don't get after you hear from him a bit, like, you don't get the idea that he's a scientist or anything, but you definitely get the idea that he knows what he's talking about, and he's competent, and, you know, whatever it is that he does, he's probably a pretty good at it. And, you know, turns out, yeah, he's a detective, and he was pretty good at it.
Yeah. So, next up we have Lotus, whom we've mentioned before. And she's number 8, and her name comes from the number of petals on a lotus.
Yes, and she had 2 kids who were in the previous Nonary game. That's how she's involved. Mm-hmm. And so she has been like on this like decade-long quest of trying to figure out the heck happened to her kids, because they won't really talk about it. And so that's kind of how she's tied into the story. I honestly zone out around Lotus a lot, so I just don't know much about her or have many opinions.
Is it the outfit? Does the outfit make you zone out?
It makes me look the other way, is what it makes me do.
But yeah, so, and Lotus is kind of, there's a word for what she is, but this is a family-friendly podcast, so yeah, she's kind of terse, and she's like the first one who sort of introduces the idea of, well, maybe we should betray each other. Like, she approaches Junpei and June about possibly forming an alliance or something, and you know, Junpei's like, no, we're not doing that.
Right, yeah. She's definitely of the characters, like, she seems like she's kind of a loose lady, and then she's kind of cutthroat is probably a good word for
cutthroat. That's a good word for it.
She's very she's mama bear, because she's here to figure out what happened to her 2 kids, and so she really is kind of willing to literally like throw anybody under the bus at any time in order to get out of here alive, get back to her kids, and hopefully find out what happened to them, which I guess she's finding out in a very real way at this point. But she always ends up being kidnapped by Ace near the end of every storyline, pretty much, because Ace is aware that if he has her, he can get to 9 very easily. And so he usually ends up kidnapping her somewhere near the end of the story. So even though she does seem to be like the one that you might have to worry about, like, turning on someone at the end of the story, she never has that opportunity because she's always being held at gunpoint or knife point or something.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing about her is that she's works in IT, honestly.
Yeah, there's like one puzzle where like she like hacks the mainframe essentially, right?
Yeah, well, she does a brute force attack. She writes a script to do a brute force attack, but the problem is she's not logged into the computer. That's the reason why you need the brute force attack. And it's like, how did you write the program on the computer if you were not logged in and able to like get access to like a text editor and something that could run the script or a compiler?
Yeah, if she had 2 computers and a thumb drive, maybe she could have got away with it. Which is kind of funny because obviously there would have been programmers involved with making this game, but whatever.
Yeah, well, probably one of them pointed it out and it's like, shut up, the story needs to happen.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, so she's honestly not the most interesting character. And speaking of uninteresting characters, we'll finish our whirlwind tour that took probably like 40 minutes. Of the participants with man number 9, and he does not have a code name.
No, because he dies like instantly.
Yeah, he gets exploded at the very beginning. He's kind of there to show. Well, there's a couple of reasons. The digital root, if you add 9 to it, it doesn't change. So he would have been too convenient to have in the story, and they point that out. But yeah, he gets he gets blown up very early on. He like freaks out, pulls a knife, tries to kidnap Clover. Then when he gets through the door, he can't turn off the bombs because he went in by himself, and he explodes.
Right, which he did because he was involved in the original Nonary games as well, which is part of the reason he got brought here. That's part of like kind of the more of the revenge plot part of it. And Ace lied to him and told him that it was different this time. You could go into the room by yourself, and so he was going to just try to get out and like survive by himself and not worry about anyone else. But Ace was trying to get him killed because Ace wanted the 9, because like you said, the 9 is really convenient to have.
Yeah. And I guess I should point out, while we're on the topic of other people who were involved, there were 4 people who were like the higher-ups involved in this project in the story. And one of them was the guy who was dressed up as Snake and got exploded. And then the other one you find dead in one of the puzzle rooms. So all the people die. Well, Ace doesn't die in the end. They take him in to, I guess, have him turned in or something.
Yeah, theoretically, he will receive his just desserts as long as the whole world doesn't end or something in the next little bit of time. So, yeah, it's a super convoluted, crazy thing with these 4 previous characters who are all there, but are three out of the 4 are dead pretty much as soon as the story starts. I mean, like I said, 9 technically dies right as the story starts, but he might as well be dead. So then, yeah, you just have Ace that whole time, and I think there wasn't really a reason to have them as part of the game other than to have them, like, to punish them for their crimes, essentially, right? Like, I mean, they needed a certain number of people to be in it, but I don't think they ever give, like, a good reason for a lot of the characters. But for them, I'm pretty sure it's like, yeah, no, we wanted revenge on these guys for what they did.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that no one actually had to die in the Nonary games. Like, they could have gotten out if one of them had just, like, confessed on video, which was interesting.
Right. So, yeah, they were each, a lot of the characters were given extra information that you aren't aware of until later on. For instance, Snake was given extra information on Braille. That's how he kind of exposits how some of the watch, the bracelet mechanics work and stuff like that. So presumably Ace and Man Number 9 might have been told that they could just admit to their crimes on camera and that everything would be over, but they won't do. So, you know, that's that. The Number 9, do we even ever find out what his real name was?
Yeah, they like list all of the people who were involved at some point.
So he does have an official name, but it's just like, you know, a name.
I mean, so we also learned Ace's real name. It was like Gintoru, like Haido or something. I don't think Haido was it, but it was something like that. You know, it's one of those things that would sound really good if you did it in a very guttural Japanese accent.
Yeah, I'm sure. So moving on from the characters into story, talking about this whole idea of having these multiple, like, branching story paths, what's actually really cool is lots of games do this, where there's, like, a true ending or whatever, but few execute well on having a reason why you're replaying the game in order to access these separate storylines. But because the whole story is about this, like, collective unconsciousness, information being passed between space, and then at the end of the story you find out it also can be passed through time, there's actually a concept where you're actually learning this information in a different timeline and actually passing it psychically to yourself in another timeline where you didn't die at the hands of a crazy axe murderer or whatever.
Right, and so, that is actually like a really cool way of sort of tying in the way the story is presented with the actual story itself.
Exactly. So it's like truly interesting because there's a handful of games that have multiple timelines and stuff like that are not very well executed. There's a couple are really well.
Zelda!
Yeah. Yeah. And then of course there's lots of games that have multiple endings, but it doesn't mean anything. And this one I felt like did a really like bang up job of giving you like a real reason why why am I having to watch this guy do this thing the wrong way 6 times before I can see him do it the right way once? And it's
technically, you only have to watch him do it the wrong way 5 times. Or no. Yes. So there are 6 endings, so one of them's the golden ending. So you only have to watch him do it the wrong way 4 times.
Yes, although technically...
I did not get the coffin ending, as it's called, at all.
Oh, really? Yes. So I got the coffin ending beforehand. Also, technically, although we didn't get to experience it, and I don't know how important it is to the story, this was released as a purely visual novel without the puzzle rooms on iOS, and there was a 7th ending added to the game called the syringe ending.
Mm-hmm. And I'm told that it was not terribly interesting.
Yep, no, it doesn't seem like it was from what I read about it, so not hardly worth mentioning. But that just to say that, like, if you're gonna have multiple, like, story paths in a game, like, this is a cool way to do it, where it, like, actually has an in-universe story reason for why it matters.
Yep, and, you know, they do kind of touch on it in the final ending, where the characters, like, knows things from other timelines that he shouldn't know, and they're like, how did you know that? And he's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
And the Akane, we kind of mentioned this, so Akane, there's this notion of, like, telepathy and being able to communicate with people over distance, but Akane has the ability to do that across time and sort of like peer down the timeline and then take information from that and move it over. So that's what's going on there.
Right, and that's where you get into the surreal conspiracies and the ending of the game, is that, like, Akane is the second screen. So when you have the narrative and the adventure description of things, the stuff that's going on in Junpei's head is actually Akane's account of it, looking forward through time through his eyes. And you don't realize this at all until the end. And on the DS, you have apparently her narration there the entire time as a separate entity, and you don't realize it's a separate entity until the end of the game, which is truly interesting. Like, it's a cool concept, and you can really tell that the developers were really thinking, how can I use this interesting 2-screen device to get, like, an experience that would be almost impossible to experience in any other way.
Yeah, and I have to say, playing this on a single screen monitor really did kind of lose some of that aha moment.
Exactly, yeah.
Like, I didn't even realize that what was supposed to be going on between the two versions until I read about it after doing some research on the game after I beat it.
Exactly, and that is one of the few disappointing things about playing the new version versus playing it on the DS is, yeah, like you say, it's expensive on the DS, and there's a lot of quality of life things that they did on this version that's wonderful. I really like the voice acting. That one thing would probably be pretty cool if that could have been the first way that you experienced the game, like back in the day, is to actually get to see that the way it was intended to be.
But as we've alluded to several times, there's a lot of like kind of pseudoscience and interesting sort of historical conspiracy sort of stuff that actually is imported kind of from the real world, like the idea that the Titanic had a sister ship called the Gigantic. In real life, it wasn't ever called the Gigantic. That the source of that rumor, there was a rumor that it was going to be called the Gigantic, but they changed the name because of what happened to the Titanic, and people don't want to draw the conclusion about it. So it did have a sister ship. It was a medical ship in World War I, but it was called what was it? The Britannia, I think.
I think so, yeah.
And it was. It's currently at the bottom of the Aegean Sea. It did not run aground after it hit a mine.
Yeah, it's really, they put that in there, that, just tweaking some of the actual facts, but using like real facts as a basis. They mention like an actual story that really was written about a giant ship that was unsinkable that had a similar name, like the Titan or something like that sunk, that came out years before the Titanic sank in the ocean, and like that's a real story that actually did happen. And there's just like all these weird things, and so every time they mention something, when they get into the pseudoscience stuff and they're like, yeah, there's this special type of ice that doesn't melt at certain temperatures, and you're like, well, that sounds like a lot of hogwash, but everything else you've said at this point was kind of sort of true, so what's going on, like
Yeah, it is really interesting getting this, like, because once I realized that something actually was up with these stories, it's like, okay, now I have to research each and every one of them.
Right. It made each story that they told you truly interesting because you wanted to know what was real and what was fake. And then you started like really paying attention. And so then whenever the stories ended up mattering later on, because you were paying attention, you're like, oh, that makes sense. Like, the world they created, because it's half real.
Yeah, I would say the only issue I have with these stories is that they do not segue into them very cleanly. Like, the character will just go on this long tangent about, I remember once reading about this experiment that was done in the UK, and it's like, okay, what does that have to do? What?
Absolutely. Yeah, that is its main weakness, is that once you're into the game and your suspension of disbelief has started to really kick in more and you're along for the ride, it's not as big of a deal. But especially the first 2 or 3 times that someone's just like, it's weird, we're locked in this room. Have I ever told you about an Egyptian mummy? It's like, what are you talking about? There's like a lot of moments like that, and like you do kind of wonder, like, how could you have segued into this more naturally or whatever. But I guess maybe they're like kind of leaning on the whole collective unconsciousness thing. Maybe everybody on the ship was connecting to the real story of what was happening and just accidentally tapping into the important information and just spitting it out because it was part of the whole time travel, space, mind, psychic link, face blindness thing.
Yeah. Let's move on to the and try to go briefly, because we have been going on for quite some time now. The ending.
Yeah.
And so I really like the twist that, so they talk about the original Nonary games that was set up so that you had a facility in Nevada, and then you had the gigantic out in the middle of the ocean someplace, I don't know where. And you had the children in the facility in Nevada, I think it was called Compound Q, having to solve the puzzles and then send it, like, the information on how to solve those puzzles psychically to the kids on the ship. And in the end, you find, and you learn that the ship sinks at some point in this experiment. And so you're like, how is this working? And it's revealed that no, you were in the Nevada complex this entire time, and you were never actually in any threat of sinking.
Yeah, exactly. Because like there's water that's like coming in through the window in one puzzle, and like the ground floor is flooded, and so you're like, and you're told you need to get out of here within 9 hours, and so you have this general idea of, I'm on a boat and we're all gonna die and drown in 9 hours, which does add a little bit to the, like, obviously it's a game and it's a visual novel, and so you have all the time in the world, but there is like, it does add to the tension of the story to like know that these characters could just drown anytime,
Mm-hmm.
So it's a cool, interesting thing. And then you come out at the end and like, oh wait, you're in the desert. You're literally in the desert. It's the farthest you could possibly be from being on a boat.
Yeah, and it's also pretty heavily suggested that there were never any bombs in anyone other than the people who were part of the original Nonary games.
Right,
planning.
because at the end of the day, Akane needed to put this all on, but didn't actually want anyone to be hurt except for people who hurt her. Mm-hmm. So now that we're here and we've discussed all the characters and we know about the unfolding story paths and we're here to talk about the ending and stuff, we can finally just kind of go on a very brief, just Akane was in the original Nonary games and Seven didn't save her, so she was going to be dead. But because of this whole paradoxical timeline nonsense, she's still alive, but she's only alive if Junpei goes through this version of the Nonary games and then sends her the answers to her 12-year-old self in the past, because they have a deep connection to each other, so she can communicate with him over time, not just space, like Ace was hoping they would be able to accomplish. And so you have to go through all of this in order to get to the end and solve the final puzzle and send the answers back in time to Akane. If she doesn't put all of these people through this horrible ordeal, she will die, and then she couldn't have ever done this. So she's in this weird paradox that she has to do this. It's been like preordained because she's alive, which means she did do it, but she hasn't done it yet, so she has to do it.
Yeah. So, did you get all that? No? Anyway, yeah, so that's basically the story and our thoughts on the characters and some of the more notable parts of it. There's just one more thing that I kind of want to get off my chest about this, and is, why did you leave the gun?
Right, yeah, the gun was just there, and then it got used mostly by Ace to cause problems.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, Junpei, look, okay, I get it. You don't want anyone to have a gun because that gives them an unfair advantage over everyone else, and that they can, like, you know, tyrannize everyone. That happened anyway. Why? Because you left the gun behind. Do you know how you handle that situation? You take the gun, you pull the bullets out of it, and you distribute the bullets to everyone else. And if possible, you disassemble the gun. It's a revolver. You pull the cylinder out if you can, and you hand the cylinder to someone else, so that you need multiple people to agree that, yeah, it's time to shoot someone, to actually shoot someone. Like, you did not see someone going back and grabbing it without you, when your back was turned. You did not see that coming. Like, Junpei, what is wrong with you?
Absolutely. That gun was clearly just, to be in the story, just to cause problems and give people opportunities to turn on each other and stuff. And yeah, there are multiple locations, we might add, that are completely submerged in water. Mm-hmm. You could toss an entire gun in one of those areas, and it would be pretty much impossible to get to. Like,
yeah, that's a good point too. I don't know why I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, if they wanted to actually say no one can use a gun no matter what, they could have literally disposed of the gun as a group. Like you say, pull the bullets out, hand the bullets to everybody else, so no one person has any way of hurting someone else. You all walk together to a body of water, chuck the gun in. Done. All right, so the one thing that I wanted to get into before we close down, this is one of the differences between the English and the Japanese version of the game, which is truly interesting. Okay, so in the Japanese version of the game, at the end, this is something we didn't really talk about. The final door is not a 9 door, it's a Q door. Mm-hmm. And the way that works is it's based on a base 10 system using, like, numbers to the alphabet, blah, blah, blah. So instead
it's not a base 10 system, but continue.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, yeah, it's a base 27 system, I think. But anyway, they have to, instead of using the digital root to get to 9, they have to use a certain combination to represent Q in the alphabet, which I think was 26 or something like that. Anyway, not important entirely. But here's the interesting part. In the Japanese version of the game, the explanation for the door opening having a Q is that 9 in Japanese is pronounced Q.
Oh, yeah, it is, isn't it?
So in the English version, he doesn't say over the intercom to find the door with a Q on it. They had to change it to be a note that says to look for a door with a and then a lowercase q, and you think it's a 9. So, like, it's just super interesting because this is a coincidence that a lowercase q looks like a 9, and in Japanese, the word 9 sounds like Q. And so it just so happens that the twist ending with the 9 and the Q works in both English and Japanese. And that's just neat to me. So strange. Especially because 9 is obviously so important for the whole story of the game. And so, for it to just so happen to still fit that rule seemed really interesting to me. I appreciated it.
So my final thoughts are, if you want a good cult classic from the DS era that has a great mystery that unfolds and you gradually learn more and more about the characters and how they relate to each other and how it connects to events in the distant past and has a kind of a supernatural element, then pick up Ghost Trick when it comes out on the Nintendo Switch for in June 30th, I believe. It is a great game. It has a wonderful soundtrack, awesome characters, the best paced story I've ever played in a game. But until then, 9 hours, 9 persons, 9 doors is not a bad way to fill the time while you wait for Ghost Trick.
Yeah, no, it's truly an enjoyable, interesting thing, and there's 3 games in this series, and although The first one might be my favorite of the three. They are all really enjoyable, and if you do go on to play the other ones, buckle up, because there's characters that are from these ones in those ones, and the insanity of the wait, what? That's what's going on just keeps going. So if you enjoy like that kind of general concept of like high stakes murder mystery stuff with crazy weird twists and pseudoscience like supernatural stuff, then 999 and then the two sequels to it are definitely worth playing. And yeah, like Glenn said, it's they're on Steam and they go on sale randomly for like super cheap. So it's definitely worth looking into. So there are a few games that just grab my attention and I will play from start to finish. There's probably 50 games that I've ever played in my whole life that were that way, and all three of the games in this series were that way for me. So it's definitely high up on that list. And yeah, just in closing, for final thoughts, the whole reason why I thought this game was worth talking about on here, other than just that I like it a lot, is that, again, it's just so weird to me that you got this on a Nintendo handheld, specifically made for a Nintendo handheld, and so it will always have a weird, interesting place, I think, in video game history as being, like, a truly interesting, sort of, like, oddity, for something to exist in this space on that console at that time, when Nintendo is very rarely allowed mature games on their handheld consoles at all, except for maybe the occasional Resident Evil game, I suppose.
So I just want to say, before we wrap up, thank you, Nathaniel, for twisting my arm and making me play this game, because I probably never would have given it a shot if you didn't force me to do it for this podcast.
Yeah, no worries. I'm really happy to get somebody, at least mostly interested in this series, because it seems like talking to you right before we did this, and then even during the podcast, that like you tended to have quite a bit of fun with it, and way more fun than you thought you would have.
Yeah, definitely. So, Nathaniel, where can people find you for more recommendations for cult classic games?
You can find me over on YouTube, Nathan Blake Games. You can find my Twitter at Nathan Blake Game, no S. And then I'm on Twitch, Nathan Blake Games as well. I haven't been doing anything over there for a good while. I'm on hiatus at the moment, but I literally was just talking to family about how once things get a little more settled in my current job, I'm going to be like getting back into at least live streaming, so that I don't have to like devote as much time to like prep, but can still like make content and enjoy stuff with people, because over on my channel, like, I'm big about how games are art and art is important. And so playing into this exact same idea of like, I like to experience the art of games and what that comes with it, which is why I like weird games that are cult classics and stuff like that, and almost like weird moments in time that like people didn't expect to happen or that are truly interesting. And so, yeah, especially on my live streaming, I do tend to play like older games and stuff like that, and weird stuff that I missed whenever I was younger. So, if you want to check that stuff out, you can. Thank you.
Yeah, and if you want to see more stuff from Two Butts and Crew, you can subscribe to our channel on YouTube, where we release podcast episodes like this one, as well as the occasional game review. Additionally, we have a website where we have a huge back catalog of many blog articles, and also a free adventure module for the 1D4chan Legend of Zelda RPG Expedition to the Hauno Woods. It's there to help you get started with one of my favorite role-playing systems. And yeah, check it out. It doesn't cost you anything, and even if you don't want to play the 1D4chan RPG system, you can still tear it apart and mine it for ideas. Anyway, thank you for listening, everyone, to the Two Butts and Crew podcast, episode 36, the digital root of which is
9.
Yeah, we did not plan that, by the way.
Ah, that's great. Sayonara, everyone.
Thank you for listening. Bye.